The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on Fifth Street, mingling with the exhaust fumes of buses rumbling past. I walked the same route every day, my messenger bag heavy with a laptop and dreams that felt just as burdensome. The city had a rhythm, and I had learned to move with it, head down, earbuds in, another face in the endless stream of commuters. She sat on the corner of Fifth and Madison, her weathered hands cupped together, a cardboard sign propped against the brick wall behind her. The words were simple. Anything helps. God bless. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore layers despite the warming spring weather. A tattered blanket covered her legs, and beside her sat a small cloth bag, presumably holding everything she owned. I didn't know when I started giving her change. It wasn't a conscious decision, not some grand gesture of charity. One morning, I had coins jangling in my pocket, and she looked up as I passed. Our eyes met for just a second. The next thing I knew, I was dropping quarters and dimes into her cup. It became routine. Every weekday morning, I'd stop, reach into my pocket, and deposit whatever loose change I had. Sometimes it was $1 in coins, sometimes just 30 cents. She'd nod, whisper, "God bless you," and I'd continue to the office where I worked as a junior copywriter, crafting advertisements for products I'd never buy. We never spoke beyond those brief exchanges. I didn't ask her name. She didn't ask mine. In the city, that's how things worked. You could pass the same person every day for years and know nothing about them except the shape of their shadow. Weeks turned into months. Summer arrived with its oppressive heat, and I'd sometimes bring her a bottle of water along with the change. She'd accept it with the same quiet gratitude, those weathered hands wrapping around the plastic with surprising gentleness. Her eyes were blue, I noticed. Faded like old denim, but clear and alert. I never thought of myself as particularly generous. The change I gave her was money I'd otherwise lose in the couch cushions or leave in a jar on my dresser. It cost me nothing, really. I'd see other people walk past without a glance, and I didn't judge them. Everyone has their reasons, their own struggles, their own way of moving through the world. My life was unremarkable. I was 28, single, living in a studio apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant below it. My job was fine. My friends were few. I'd moved to the city 3 years earlier with ambitions of becoming a novelist, but the only thing I'd written lately were taglines for laundry detergent. Clean isn't just a smell, it's a promise. That was my latest contribution to humanity. The old lady became a fixture in my routine, as reliable as my morning coffee or the broken streetlight on the corner. I never questioned why she was there or what circumstances had led her to that particular spot. It wasn't my business, and honestly, I was too wrapped up in my own dissatisfaction to think deeply about anyone else. October came, painting the city in shades of amber and rust. The air turned crisp, and I started wearing my jacket again. The old lady had acquired a heavier blanket, dark blue and moth-eaten along one edge. Her cup had changed too, from a paper coffee cup to a sturdy plastic container that wouldn't blow away in the wind. That's when things changed. It was a Thursday morning, October 18th. I remember because I'd just gotten news that I was being passed over for a promotion I'd assumed was mine. Some kid fresh out of college, all energy and enthusiasm, had impressed the creative director with his innovative approach to consumer engagement. I was in a foul mood, stomping down Fifth Street with my jaw clenched and my pride bruised. I almost walked past her. The change in my pocket felt heavier than usual, weighted with resentment and failure. But habit is a powerful thing. I stopped, dug out a handful of coins, and dropped them into her container. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin rough as tree bark. I froze, shocked by the unexpected contact. In all these months, she'd never touched me, never broken the unspoken boundary between giver and receiver. "Thank you," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than the whispered blessings I was used to. "But I need to tell you something." I looked down at her, really looked at her for the first time. The lines on her face told stories I couldn't read, carved deep around her eyes and mouth. But those blue eyes held something I hadn't expected. Intelligence, purpose, a sharpness that seemed at odds with her situation. "Okay," I said, uncertain. She released my wrist and gestured to the ground beside her. "Sit. Just for a moment." Common sense told me to make an excuse and leave. I'd be late for work. Someone might see. It was awkward. But something in her gaze held me there, and before I fully decided, I was lowering myself to the cold concrete beside her. "My name is Margaret," she said. "Margaret Chen." "David," I replied. "David Foster." She nodded as if she'd already known. "David, I've been watching you for 6 months. Every day you stop. Every day you give what you can. You don't do it for show. You don't make a performance of it. You just do it." I shifted uncomfortably. "It's just change." "It's never just anything," Margaret said. "Every action carries weight, David. Every choice ripples outward in ways we can't see." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Margaret looked out at the street, watching the endless parade of people. "Do you know why I'm here?" "I know." I never asked. Most don't. They see the surface and think they understand the story. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I was a professor once. Mathematics. I taught at Columbia for 32 years. I blinked, trying to reconcile the woman beside me with the image of a university professor. "What happened?" "Life happened. My husband died. Cancer, slow and expensive. We had insurance, but it wasn't enough. It's never enough, not when you're fighting that battle. I sold our house to pay for treatments that bought him 6 more months. 6 months of pain, but 6 months I wouldn't trade for anything." Her voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "After he died, I discovered he'd taken out a second mortgage I didn't know about, trying to protect me from the weight of our debt. The bank foreclosed. I had nowhere to go, no family left. I applied for jobs, but I was 68 years old, grieving, and frankly, nobody wants to hire someone like that. Not when there are younger, cheaper options." I felt something twist in my chest. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm not telling you this for pity." Margaret turned to face me directly. "I'm telling you because you need to understand something. We're all closer to this than we think. A few bad breaks, a illness, a loss, that's all it takes. The distance between comfortable and desperate is shorter than anyone wants to believe." A woman in heels clicked past, talking loudly into her phone about a client meeting. Margaret waited until she was gone before continuing. "But that's not why I stopped you today. I stopped you because you've been sleepwalking through your life, David, and I think it's time you woke up." I felt defensive. "You don't know anything about my life." "Don't I?" "You dress well enough, but your clothes are old, worn at the edges. You carry yourself like someone who's given up on something important. Your eyes are distant every morning, like you're already tired of the day before it begins. And the way you drop that change, it's mechanical. You're going through motions, not making choices." She was right, but I didn't want to admit it. "What do you want from me?" "I want to give you something," Margaret said. She reached into her cloth bag and pulled out a small leather journal, its cover cracked with age. This was my husband's. He was a writer, a good one. Never published, never tried to, but he wrote every day of his adult life. Stories, observations, thoughts about the world. She held it out to me, and I took it reflexively. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because you're a writer who's stopped writing. I can tell. It's in the way you watch people, like you're collecting details but don't know what to do with them anymore. This journal, it's not valuable to anyone but me, and I've read every page 1,000 times. Maybe it will remind you that writing isn't about success or publication or impressing anyone. It's about paying attention. It's about bearing witness to the world. I opened the journal carefully. The handwriting was neat, precise. The first entry was dated 30 years ago. "I can't take this," I said. "It's too personal, too. I'm giving it to you because I want to. Because in 6 months, you've been kind without asking anything in return, and that's rarer than you think. Because I won't be here much longer, and I'd rather this go to someone who might value it than end up in a dumpster when I'm gone." "What do you mean, you won't be here?" Margaret smiled, and it transformed her face. "I'm 73 years old, David. I have a heart condition that requires medication I can't afford. The shelter has helped me get some, but it's not enough. I'm not telling you this to upset you. I'm telling you because it's the truth, and I'm tired of people dancing around truth like it's something to fear." I felt panic rising. "I can help. I can. I don't have much, but I can." "You can do nothing for my heart except what you've already been doing. You can be kind. You can see me as a person, not a problem to be solved. And you can take this journal and let it mean something." We sat in silence for a long moment. The city moved around us, indifferent to our small moment of connection. "I need to tell you something else," Margaret said. 3 years ago, right before my husband died, he made me promise something. He made me promise that if I ever ended up in a situation where I needed help, I wouldn't give up. He made me promise I'd keep teaching, even if I had no classroom. How do you teach without a classroom? I watch. I wait. And when someone shows me, through their consistent actions, that they're ready to learn something, I teach them. She gestured to the journal in my hands. "Consider this your first lesson. The second lesson is this: stop giving me change." I looked up, confused. "What?" "Your change isn't changing anything, David. Not for me, not for you. It's a ritual that lets you feel good without actually engaging with the discomfort of the world. I don't need your quarters. I need you to wake up." Her words stung because they were true. "Instead of giving me money you don't miss, I want you to do something harder. I want you to write. Really write. Not advertising copy, not taglines. Stories. Real stories about real people. Start with me if you want. Start with the man in your office who everyone ignores. Start with the woman who serves your coffee. Bear witness to the world, David. That's the only currency that matters." I looked down at the journal, then back at her. "I don't know if I can." "You can. You're just scared. Fear of failure, fear of success, fear of finding out you're not who you thought you were. These fears run our lives if we let them. Don't let them." I stood slowly, my legs stiff from sitting on the cold concrete. "I'll think about it." "Don't think. Do." Thinking is how we talk ourselves out of the things that matter. Margaret settled back against the wall. "And David, when you walk past tomorrow, don't stop. Just nod and keep walking. Our transaction is complete." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my small bed, listening to the sounds of the city filtering through my window, and I thought about Margaret's words. I thought about the distance between comfortable and desperate. I thought about my own life, my own quiet desperation that looked nothing like hers but felt just as suffocating in its own way. At 2 in the morning, I got up and opened the journal. The first entry was about a sunset. Nothing profound, just a detailed observation of colors and clouds and the way light transformed ordinary buildings into something momentarily beautiful. But there was love in the description, care in the choice of words. This was someone who had paid attention to a sunset not because it was extraordinary, but because it was there, because it was real, because it mattered. I read for 2 hours, jumping randomly through the journal. There were stories about teaching high school English, about the first time he met Margaret, about his father's death and his mother's courage. There were observations about strangers on the subway, about the way people's faces changed when they thought no one was watching. There were questions about God and meaning and whether suffering had purpose or was just the random chaos of existence. It wasn't perfect writing. There were cliches and awkward phrasings. But it was honest. It was alive. It was a life distilled into words, and it was more valuable than anything I'd produced in 3 years of advertising copy. I opened my laptop and created a new document. My fingers hovered over the keys. Then I began to write. I wrote about the morning routine, about the city's rhythm, about the old lady on the corner who I'd given change to for 6 months without ever really seeing. I wrote about what she'd told me, about her husband and her loss and the thin line between stability and disaster. I wrote until the sun came up, until my coffee went cold, until my hands ached. When I stopped, I had 4,000 words. They weren't good words, not yet. But they were real. That morning, walking to work, I passed Margaret as instructed. She looked up, our eyes met, and I nodded. She nodded back, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I kept walking. It felt wrong not to stop, like breaking a promise. But I understood what she was asking. She was asking me to stop performing kindness and start living intentionally. She was asking me to transform routine into purpose. I wrote every night that week. Stories began pouring out of me, things I'd been storing up without realizing it. I wrote about my coworker Marcus, who everyone dismissed as lazy but who was actually working 2 jobs to support his sick mother. I wrote about the barista who remembered everyone's orders and whose name nobody ever asked. I wrote about the city itself, the way it crushed and elevated, destroyed and created, all at the same time. On Friday, I stopped by Margaret's corner after work. I'd printed out the story I'd written about her, changed the names but kept the truth of it. I told you not to stop, she said, but her eyes were warm. I'm not stopping. I'm visiting. There's a difference. I handed her the pages. I wrote this. I wanted you to read it. She took the papers carefully, as if they were fragile. I'll read it tonight. Thank you, I said. For the journal. For everything you said. Thank me by keeping the promise you're making right now. Thank me by being awake in your own life. I nodded and walked away. The next Monday, I passed her corner at my usual time. She wasn't there. Her blanket was gone, her container, her sign. The spot where she'd sat for months was just another piece of empty sidewalk. My heart dropped. I asked the man who ran the newsstand on the corner if he'd seen her. He shrugged. Haven't seen her since Friday. People like that, they move around. Maybe she found a shelter spot. But I knew. Somehow I knew. I spent my lunch break calling shelters, describing Margaret. On the 5th call, I found someone who knew her. The woman's voice was kind but tired. Margaret Chen? She passed away Saturday morning. Heart gave out. We found your story in her belongings. She'd written something on the back. My hands were shaking. What did she write? She wrote, "He woke up. My work is done." I had to sit down. The woman on the phone was still talking, something about arrangements and her effects, but I couldn't process it. Margaret was gone. The old lady I'd given change to, the professor who'd survived loss and poverty and still found purpose in teaching someone like me, she was gone. They asked if I wanted her belongings. She'd listed me as her contact, though I had no idea when or how. There wasn't much, the blanket, some clothes, a plastic bag of medication she hadn't been able to afford enough of, and a stack of notebooks. Her own journals, filled with mathematics equations and personal observations and letters to her dead husband. I spent weeks reading through them. Margaret had been writing too, all this time. She'd been documenting her life on the streets, the people she met, the kindnesses and cruelties of the city. She'd been teaching, always teaching, even when she had no classroom, no students, no recognition. In the last notebook, dated the week before she died, she'd written about me. About watching me walk past day after day, about choosing me specifically to receive her husband's journal. She'd written, "David carries the weight of abandoned dreams. I see it in the slump of his shoulders, the distance in his eyes. He's been kind to me, but he's been cruel to himself, giving up on the person he wanted to be. If I can do one last thing with my time here, maybe I can reflect back to him what he's forgotten, that we're not defined by our circumstances but by what we choose to do within them. That bearing witness matters. That truth, however painful, is always better than comfortable lies." She'd chosen me. Out of hundreds of people who walked past her corner, she'd chosen me to teach. I quit my job 2 weeks after her death. Not in a blaze of glory, not with a dramatic speech. I just gave my notice, finished my projects, and walked out with a box of personal items that fit easily under one arm. I took a job bartending at night, which paid enough for rent and food and left my days free. I wrote stories about Margaret, about her husband, about the invisible people who make up the city's fabric. I wrote about Marcus and the barista and the newsstand owner. I wrote about the distance between what we show the world and what we hide inside ourselves. A year later, I published my first story in a small literary magazine. It didn't pay anything, but seeing my words in print, knowing that someone might read them and feel something, understand something, that was worth more than any advertising campaign. I kept Margaret's journals, along with her husband's. They sat on my desk while I wrote, a reminder of what mattered. Sometimes I'd read through them, marveling at the fullness of their lives, the way they'd found meaning in teaching and learning and paying attention, even when the world had knocked them down. I thought about what she'd said about being closer to the edge than we thought. She was right. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, one disaster away from financial collapse, but I'd been pretending I had it all figured out. Everyone was. We were all walking the same tightrope, pretending it was solid ground. But there was freedom in acknowledging that fragility. It made me braver. If I was already close to the edge, what did I have to lose by taking risks, by choosing purpose over security, by writing the stories that mattered instead of the ones that paid? I started volunteering at the shelter where Margaret had stayed sometimes. I didn't give money because I didn't have money to give. I gave time. I listened to stories. I bore witness. There were dozens of Margarets there, people with rich histories and broken bodies, dreams that had been worn down by time and circumstance but not extinguished. I wrote their stories, with their permission. I gave them printed copies. Some kept them, treasuring having their lives acknowledged. Others couldn't have cared less. That was okay too. The point wasn't the reception. The point was the attention, the act of seeing people as fully human, as worthy of having their stories told. 5 years after Margaret's death, I published a collection of short stories. It was a small press, small print run, but the reviews were good. People responded to the humanity in the stories, the way they illuminated lives usually kept in shadow. I dedicated the book to Margaret Chen and her husband, whose name I'd learned from the journals was Robert. The book changed my life, but not in the way I'd once fantasized about. I didn't become famous or rich. I still bartended. I still lived in a small apartment. But I was awake. I was present. I was doing the work I was meant to do, and that made every morning worthwhile. I thought about Margaret every day. About her sitting on that corner, watching the stream of humanity flow past, choosing the moments when she could still teach. About her husband writing his observations, bearing witness to sunsets and ordinary moments because they mattered. About the change I'd given her that had changed nothing, and the journal she'd given me that had changed everything. Sometimes I walked past her old corner. Someone else usually sat there now, a young man with a dog, his own story of how he'd ended up there. I didn't give him change. I stopped and talked to him instead, asked his name, Jeremy, asked about the dog, Chance, asked if he needed anything specific. Sometimes I brought him food. Sometimes I just sat and listened. I didn't do it because it made me feel good, though sometimes it did. I didn't do it because I thought I could save anyone. You can't save people who aren't drowning by their own definition. I did it because Margaret had taught me that bearing witness was a form of love, and love was the only currency that actually circulated through the world, creating value. On the 5-year anniversary of her death, I visited the cemetery where she was buried. The shelter had arranged for a simple grave, and I'd contributed what I could to make sure she had a headstone. It was modest, just her name and dates and a line from one of her journal entries that seemed to sum up her philosophy: pay attention. It all matters. I sat by her grave and read from the collection of stories. I told her about the people I'd met, the stories I'd gathered, the ways her final lesson had rippled outward through my life and into the lives of others. I told her about Jeremy and Chance, about the bartending job and the small apartment, about the fullness of a life that looked empty by conventional standards but was actually overflowing. You were right, I said to the stone. About everything. The change didn't change anything. But you did. A breeze rustled the trees overhead. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang. The city hummed in the distance, millions of people moving through their days, each carrying their own stories, their own versions of the distance between comfortable and desperate, their own opportunities to wake up or stay asleep. I thought about the morning she'd grabbed my wrist, the strength in her weathered hands. I thought about the fear I'd felt when she'd told me to stop giving change and start giving attention. I thought about how much easier it was to drop coins in a cup than to actually engage with the discomfort of the world. But engaging with that discomfort had saved me. It had given me back the person I'd abandoned when I'd taken that advertising job, when I decided that practical mattered more than purposeful, when I'd started sleepwalking through my own life. I stood up, brushed off my jeans, and placed a small stone on her grave, a Jewish tradition I'd learned from Robert's journals. A sign that someone had visited, that someone remembered, that the dead were not forgotten. Thank you, I said, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for teaching me when I didn't know I needed to learn, for giving me something real when all I was offering was spare change. Walking back through the cemetery gates, I felt the weight of my messenger bag, heavy with the laptop where I'd written 3 new stories that week. My phone buzzed with a message from Jeremy, asking if I could help him fill out job applications that weekend. I texted back a yes. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I stopped walking and just watched it, the way Robert had watched sunsets, the way Margaret had watched people. I paid attention. I bore witness. I let it matter. And in that moment, I understood the final piece of what Margaret had been trying to teach me. It wasn't about writing or charity or purpose, not exactly. It was about participation. It was about showing up fully for your own life and for the lives intersecting with yours. It was about recognizing that we're all connected, all fragile, all walking the same tightrope between stability and chaos. The distance between giving change and creating change was vast, but it wasn't uncrossable. You just had to be willing to stop performing kindness and start practicing presence. You just had to wake up. I walked home as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city transforming around me. Lights flickered on in windows. People rushed past, heading toward their own evenings. Each one carried a story. Each one mattered. And because Margaret had taken the time to teach me to see them, I would spend the rest of my life trying to capture those stories, to honor those lives, to pay attention to it all. The old lady on the corner had given me change, real change, and I would carry it with me forever. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on 5th Street, mingling with the exhaust fumes of buses rumbling past. I walked the same route every day, my messenger bag heavy with a laptop and dreams that felt just as burdensome. The city had a rhythm, and I had learned to move with it, head down, earbuds in, another face in the endless stream of commuters. She sat on the corner of 5th and Madison, her weathered hands cupped together, a cardboard sign propped against the brick wall behind her. The words were simple. Anything helps. God bless. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore layers despite the warming spring weather. A tattered blanket covered her legs, and beside her sat a small cloth bag, presumably holding everything she owned. I didn't know when I started giving her change. It wasn't a conscious decision, not some grand gesture of charity. One morning, I had coins jangling in my pocket, and she looked up as I passed. Our eyes met for just a second. The next thing I knew, I was dropping quarters and dimes into her cup. It became routine. Every weekday morning, I'd stop, reach into my pocket, and deposit whatever loose change I had. Sometimes it was $1 in coins, sometimes just 30 cents. She'd nod, whisper, "God bless you," and I'd continue to the office where I worked as a junior copywriter, crafting advertisements for products I'd never buy. We never spoke beyond those brief exchanges. I didn't ask her name. She didn't ask mine. In the city, that's how things worked. You could pass the same person every day for years and know nothing about them except the shape of their shadow. Weeks turned into months. Summer arrived with its oppressive heat, and I'd sometimes bring her a bottle of water along with the change. She'd accept it with the same quiet gratitude, those weathered hands wrapping around the plastic with surprising gentleness. Her eyes were blue, I noticed. Faded like old denim, but clear and alert.